President, Fellows of the Society, and ladies and gentlemen, I've been greatly honoured by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland to be invited to give this series of Rhind Lectures. I've been proud to be a Fellow of the Society, I was counting recently, for more than 40 years, and as Secretary in particular, I became very aware of just how significant this Rhind Lecture series has been over the years. And there's very few occasions, my wife will confirm this, when I've been dumbstruck. But when I was invited to do the Rhind Lectures, I was dumbstruck. I shall try not to be dumbstruck this weekend. In the title of this series of Rhind Lectures, you will have seen I'm bowing to Gordon Childe, whose books New Light on the Most Ancient East and The Dawn of European Civilization were the foundations of the prehistory of Europe and the Near East for many people. Childe's ideas started a new direction in field, laboratory and theoretical research. More than half a century now on from Childe's death, I shall develop what I hope you will agree is a new perspective on the Neolithic Revolution. That phrase itself, another contribution of Gordon Childe to our archaeological vocabulary. In this first lecture, I want to show how the subject of the Neolithic Revolution has moved from being a revolution in the economy, the adoption of farming, to being a social and indeed a cultural revolution. So this lecture will serve as a prospectus of the lectures that follow. In order to understand where our knowledge stands at present, it's necessary to know something about how we got to be where we are. And tracing that story briefly allows me to tell you a little about what's going to be turning up in the lectures on Saturday. And then on Sunday's lectures, I shall take you into new territory. At the latter part of this lecture, I shall also use the opportunity to introduce something of the landscape within which the dramatic story of revolution is set. And there's a certain amount of jargon that the international community of archaeologists has accumulated in order to disguise the fact that they know rather little. And it's worth spending a couple of minutes also setting out a chronological framework together with the tags and labels that have become attached. The key feature of the Neolithic Revolution has been, for most people, the adoption of farming practices. The general view is that we can identify a number of centres around the world. On this map, 3 or 4 independent centres in the Americas, where farming was independently adopted, 1 or 2 in Africa, south of the Sahara, and 3 or 4 in Asia. Opinions differ on some of these centres. The author of the map counts 10 centres, but the author of the chronological diagram allows only 7. The centre in Southwest Asia, at the top here it's called the Near East, and the reason I'm using Southwest Asia instead of Near East or Middle East is because Near East and Middle East are now completely confused, I think. So Southwest Asia is the phrase I'm using. But the centre in Southwest Asia was the first to be identified, and this has remained the centre of greatest interest to a growing number of mainly European and American researchers. From the 1930s until his death in the 1950s, Gordon Childe wrote about the Neolithic Revolution. He has defined the terms and set the direction of Neolithic research in Southwest Asia from the middle of the 20th century really till today. He's been criticised and even derided by some people, and people have repeatedly proclaimed how they have moved on in new directions, but in reality his ideas have continued to dictate the terms of research, even though many people have absorbed only a rather superficial reading of his work. It is quite remarkable how little actual data there was for Childe to use when he formulated his ideas. Of course, therefore, he got some things wrong. He can't have known all that we know now. And his dating, of course, sounds quite extraordinary. But his ideas have exercised an extraordinary hold. The American archaeologist Robert Braidwood has played a pivotal role in our story. Interestingly, just as a little sidelight, he wanted to do his PhD at Edinburgh with Gordon Childe. Gordon Childe wanted him to come to Edinburgh. It didn't work out. He did his PhD at Chicago and remained at Chicago for his whole career. As soon as he could, after the end of the Second World War, he set out to test Childe's theory in the field, first in the Piedmont and the intermontane valleys of Iraqi Kurdistan, then across the frontier in western Iran and in the 1950s, and finally in the Piedmont of southeast Turkey. His doctoral research students, who had worked in the field with him, went on to lead their own projects, like Frank Hole and Kent Flannery in southwest Iran in the mid-1960s. But among the younger generation, there was also characters like Louis Binford, who detested Robert Braidwood and left Chicago to forge a revolutionary trajectory of his own in processualist archaeology. It became fashionable in the US to deride Childe and Braidwood as hopelessly subjective and unscientific. Childe, after all, wrote culture history and was a diffusionist. In case you don't realize it, those are terms of abuse. Braidwood's crime was that he wore a tweed sports jacket and smoked a pipe. Processualist archaeology was to be new, objective and scientific, but it is surprising how much of Braidwood and Childe is still to be found in the work of those brave new archaeologists who elected to work in the field of the beginnings of agriculture. In fact, the program of the processualists nominated 3 big questions that were suitable for sustained scientific investigation, 2 of which were Childe's agricultural and urban revolutions under slightly changed names. In Britain, the early agriculture project was based in Cambridge, directed by Eric Higgs and under the general overall leadership of Graham Clark. And that bred a whole generation of new young researchers who went on to work in new, fully scientific, multidisciplinary research projects in various parts of the Near East and elsewhere, but in the Near East. It had a major impact on the techniques at any rate. And since the 1970s, we've become accustomed to new sub-disciplines and even sub-sub-disciplines and continually upgraded recovery strategies. The more rigorous sampling and recovery strategies, aimed particularly at faunal and carbonized plant remains, have produced invaluable and quantifiable data. It has also changed the way that fieldwork is conducted. As you can see at Çatalhöyük in central Turkey, there are several people working full-time on the flotation and wet sieving of large volumes of material brought from the trenches on the site. All those residues laid out to dry on the white sacks in the foreground there will be taken away and sorted for the artifacts and all the other things which they contain. And the little bags which are pegged out on the line to dry are the floated materials which will be sorted for the seeds, the chaff, the wood charcoal, the tiny land snails, and so forth. Further down the line, out of sight in the dig headquarters, there's a whole chain of specialists, archaeobotanists, archaeozoologists, engaged in the primary sorting of the material. And beyond that, of course, is all the research on this material. The work is slow and labour-intensive, and it's ironic that although there are many, many more people involved in the research these days, the progress is obtained at a frustratingly slow pace. If we are just concerned with the adoption of farming practices, which is where most of the research has been focused for the past half-century, then we do now know a lot more about the domestication of plants and animals. We're still learning about where the first steps towards domestication of plants and animals took place, but we do seem now to have quite solid dates that tell us when the process was occurring. Recently, archaeobotanists and plant geneticists have been able to apply new techniques to tell us some very interesting new information about how cultivation produced domesticated species. The paleoenvironmental scientists have sketched in broad outline the changing climatic conditions between the onset of the last glacial maximum, which was around 25,000 years ago, through the recovery from that period to another short, sharp, colder shock at the end of the Pleistocene period, the Younger Dryas phase, between 12,800 and 11,500 years ago, and on into the early Holocene, the climatic optimum, which is where our Neolithic begins. There is a powerful school of thought that argues for the Levant as the critical zone during this cooler Younger Dryas phase. The deterioration was the catalyst, they say, that pushed hunter-gatherers into intensive cultivation of some species, which led to the earliest domestication of plants. I'll return to this subject near the end of this lecture and say a little bit more about why I'm doubtful of the evidence and sceptical about the line of argument. For 20 years now, some researchers concerned with the period in Southwest Asia have begun to turn their attention to questions of social organization. Robert Braidwood had coined the phrase village farming to describe the typical social group of the early farming period. But already in the 1950s, Kathleen Kenyon was showing that the early Neolithic settlement at Jericho was on the same scale as the Bronze Age city which overlay it. And in the 1960s, James Mellart confronted the world with the site of Çatalhöyük, which is the contour plan that you see there, with the scale at 50-meter intervals, give you some idea of the size of this site. 20 meters thick of stratification, 20 meters thick of stratification, 32 hectares in extent, 13 hectares at least in metric. And it's no longer the largest Neolithic settlement we know. No one takes seriously the idea that these large settlements were urban anymore. But they are clearly not just clusters of small farmhouses or huts either. And it's taken a long time for archaeologists to face up to the fact that these large early Neolithic communities would have numbered several thousand inhabitants. Estimates for Çatalhöyük are now in the range 6,000 to 8,000 people, and it lasted for well over 1,000 years. We don't understand much of how they managed to operate successfully over centuries, in some cases, as at Çatal, for more than a millennium. Some people have begun to ask if there is a connection between the scale of these permanent communities and the amount of symbolism and symbolic activity which we find on many sites. There's now a vast literature for the final Paleolithic period and the early Neolithic of Southwest Asia. Though many of the issues have been debated at length, we're still left with some difficult questions, and although it's rarely mentioned by my fellow researchers, I placed the question that was posed by Robert Braidwood almost 60 years ago at the head of the list. Braidwood criticised Child's model for the adoption of farming practices that made climatic deterioration the triggering factor. Braidwood objected that if a climatic and environmental change were responsible, why was it that particular occurrence of the change? Any change at the end of the Pleistocene could only be a repeat of previous changes in the seesaw history of that erratic Pleistocene climate. So he asked, why then, why not earlier? We may know something about the when and the how of people taking up cultivation and herding around 10,000 years ago, but why did they do it, and why then? And why did the last Paleolithic hunter-gatherers change their settlement and subsistence strategies towards sedentism, harvesting, storage and broad-spectrum hunting? There are plenty of questions left. So, to Saturday's lectures. Tomorrow morning I shall turn first to those questions that have preoccupied so many over the years. We need to know something about where the potential domesticates, both plants, 2 species of wheat, barley, lentils, peas, beans, chickpeas, and animals, sheep, goat, cattle and pig, where they were to be found. I will outline some of the most significant knowledge that has been learned about the move from foraging to collecting, from harvesting wild plants to cultivating them, from hunting a range of wild animals to herding and domesticating a smaller range of species. And I think that it can be fitted together into an interesting and helpful scenario. The main point about the hunter-gatherers of the last millennia of the Paleolithic period in Southwest Asia was that they made a momentous switch in their subsistence strategies. In particular, they increasingly relied on harvesting and storing large supplies of wild wheat and barley, wild lentils, beans and other pulses. Farming requires a big increase in labour investment, and in addition, by narrowing the range of plants and animals on which farmers rely, it actually involves greater risk. So hunter-gatherers, we can presume, only switched to cultivation and herding because it was necessary. But having adopted mixed farming, there were two advantages to the farming economy. One was that given that children could play their part in the production process, whether weeding crops, tending sheep or scaring the crows, farming supported large families and allowed the accumulation of substantial food stores. And secondly, it was a transportable package. That meant that population expansion could be accommodated by colonization of new land to farm. Although the subtitle of the lecture refers to the second lecture on Saturday refers to the subtitle to the main series refers to the Neolithic Revolution, the critically important period is the preceding period known as the Epipaleolithic. Most accounts of this subject used the last part of the Epipaleolithic as a sort of introductory chapter to the main action in the Neolithic period. But this is a teleological attitude that arises out of the narrow focus on the beginnings of farming. Most people, looking back from our perspective, want to know where and when it began, where this way of life, which we're familiar, even if only through listening to the archers, where it came from and how it came about and how it spread to Europe. And I want to try to take a perspective that starts from the hunter-gatherers of the Paleolithic in order to see what changes they instituted and what advantages they saw. In any case, there is much more to the Epipaleolithic than a mere preface to Neolithic farming. We now know that the Epipaleolithic period in Southwest Asia lasted for more than 10,000 years. And we also know that right from the beginning, and we'll see this site in two of the lectures on Saturday, and since I haven't mentioned any site names, this one's Ohalo 2. And it dates to the last glacial maximum. And so at that date, some communities had already begun to create settlements, live all year round in one place, live by accessing a wide range of food resources that could be obtained from one situation and see them through all seasons. And by the last millennia, the last part of the Epipaleolithic period, we're certainly looking at communities that have become fully sedentary, living in large co-resident groups, larger groups than humans had ever lived before, and living successfully in the same place, not just year after year, but century after century, in some cases millennium after millennium. These were novel and successful societies who were already engaged in elaborate symbolic activities, as we'll see in the second lecture on Tuesday. Saturday. Don't wait till Tuesday. In tomorrow's third lecture, Saturday's third lecture, I shall focus on the Neolithic period, and we shall be concerned with the early Neolithic, the pre-pottery or aceramic Neolithic. This is the period within which domesticated plants and animals emerge, but over recent years the early Neolithic of Southwest Asia has also produced an extraordinary series of settlement sites that are remarkable for their size, for their puzzling locations, for their elaborate domestic architecture, for their monumental public buildings, for their sculpture, their imagery, and for their communal rituals, especially those concerning treatment of the dead. The fascinating question of how those large communities functioned is one which is only now beginning to be investigated and discussed. But there is another remarkable phenomenon that we can see emerging in the Epipaleolithic period and burgeoning in the early Neolithic, and that is one of regional and supra-regional networks of exchange of goods and materials and shared ideas and symbolic values. The map shows the extent of exchange in the black volcanic glass obsidian, which was quarried out of mountains, volcanic mountains in central and eastern Turkey. It was exchanged from hand to hand, from one community to another, as far as southern Jordan or southwestern Iran, that is for more than 800 kilometers. We've known about obsidian exchange for 40 years now. But we now know that it was only one of a number of materials that were prized and exchanged. This year is the 200th anniversary of Charles Darwin's birth, and he was a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and for a while an undergraduate at Edinburgh University. And it is 150 years since the publication of On the Origin of Species. Thomas Huxley first, and then Darwin himself, tried to follow through the implications of evolutionary theory and natural selection for the human species. If evolution was a momentous theory, human evolution and social evolution were even more hotly debated, and indeed they still are. I want to put an evolutionary cast onto the story of the development of human cognition and culture together with material archaeological culture. I think it enables us to make sense of the social developments of the Epipaleolithic and the Neolithic. What I shall argue is that humans needed the cognitive and cultural faculty to create and operate with fully symbolic systems of representation if they were to be able to live in large, permanently co-resident communities. Language is the obvious example of such a powerful symbolic system of communication, and written language is special in that it enables us to communicate and share, and also to store information for later recall. But writing is not the only such system of representing or communicating of symbolic values. In recent years, psychologists, linguists, cognitive scientists, neuroscientists and philosophers have talked with increasing intensity about theories of evolution of human cognition, language or consciousness. Of interest to us is the complex story of how we modern humans use cultural symbolism to form and maintain our individual and community identities. I shall be seeking to set the Epipaleolithic and early Neolithic of Southwest Asia in the context of that co-evolution of human cognition and culture. The sixth and final lecture in the series will then fall into place as the opportunity to weave together the different strands of information which have been introduced up in the lectures up till then. When we include the final strand of the evolved capacity of modern humans for fully symbolic systems of representation, we shall be able to answer that nagging question of Braidwood's, why then and why not earlier? Until about 10 to 12,000 years ago, I shall argue, humans were not cognitively or culturally capable of forming and sustaining the kind of permanent, large-scale, co-resident communities that were the novelty of the Epipaleolithic and the early Neolithic of Southwest Asia. Now, let's turn to some of the terms that I shall be using throughout, and it may be helpful to make clear the chronological framework. When the geological period of the Pleistocene ends, the Holocene begins. Archaeologists long ago decided that their old Stone Age, the Paleolithic period, was the same as the geologists' Pleistocene. And at first they proposed that the new Stone Age, the Neolithic, was therefore the Holocene. But then someone discovered that Paleolithic type hunter-gatherers continued beyond the end of the Pleistocene. So in Britain and Europe, the Mesolithic was invented to cover that intermediate period, which was neither Paleolithic because it was no longer Pleistocene, nor Neolithic because it didn't have polished stone tools and pottery and weaving and so on. So for quite a long time now, we've known that there's no need for the Mesolithic in Southwest Asia because the Neolithic, defined by the kind of archaeology which people decided was Neolithic, now we know goes back to the Pleistocene-Holocene boundary. So there's no Mesolithic in the Near East. But some of the cultural characteristics associated with the Mesolithic in Europe, particularly, sorry to mention this, President, microliths, are found in earlier, it's the only time I'll mention them, are found in earlier cultures in Southwest Asia. Since those complex microlith-making hunter-gatherers are Pleistocene in date, archaeologically they have to be Paleolithic. It took a French archaeologist to invent the term Epipaleolithic to label this period in the Levant. At first, it seemed that the Epipaleolithic was a relatively brief transitional period between the classic Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers and the first Neolithic farmers. But radiocarbon dating has shown that the epipaleolithic hunter-gatherers were around from at least 20,000 BC. Since the date that we have for the Pleistocene, Holocene, or Paleolithic, Neolithic boundaries around 9,600 BC, we therefore have an epipaleolithic period in Southwest Asia that is 10 millennia plus long. We can set the cooler, drier phases of the end of the Pleistocene period alongside our archaeological periods. The epipaleolithic begins when the last glacial maximum phase is in existence, and the epipaleolithic Neolithic boundary coincides with the end of that cold, brief phase known as the Younger Dryas, or Loch Lomond Stadial in parts closer to home. The diagram covers only the particular slice of time that we're concerned with here. It leaves out the rest of the Neolithic because there's not time in this lecture series to follow the story into the later pottery Neolithic or ceramic Neolithic, nor is there time to take up the subject of the spread of agriculture into Europe, North Africa, Central and South Asia. That would occupy a whole new lecture series and take beyond Tuesday. Looking more closely at our two main periods, it is convenient to split the aceramic Neolithic into two, an earlier and a later phase. We could go on and subdivide the later aceramic Neolithic into 3 or 4 subphases, which is something that archaeologists, specialists in this period, argue about interminably and without agreement. But we don't need to. Similarly, we can divide the epipaleolithic into an earlier and a late phase, and we can put dates alongside. Again, we could spend the rest of the lecture series deciding whether there are 2 or 3 subphases in the later epipaleolithic, where to draw the boundary between the upper Paleolithic and the early epipaleolithic, how many different contemporary cultural groups we could identify in part of the Levant at any stage. But again, we don't need to, so we'll keep it that simple. Now let's go on to the physical features in the last few minutes. Let's look at the landscapes of prehistoric Southwest Asia, the stage on which our dramatic story is played out. And let's start by stripping that landscape back to its physical skeleton. We're looking back to a world before today's national frontiers were drawn up, before the big cities that we know from today's maps, Baghdad or Damascus or Antakya or Adana or Ankara, before they were built, before military and commercial needs stripped out the forests, before the landscape was intensively cultivated, before flocks of sheep and goats began to overgraze the vegetation. There are 2 very simple observations that can be made. This is a landscape on a subcontinental scale. The area of this map is similar to that of the whole of Western Europe, and it is a region of great diversity. Just compare the mountainous strip across the north of the map here, running across from Anatolia through Iran, and compare that with the vast area in the south of the map of the northern Arabian Shield. We know that large parts of this map are desert, but you may not know that there are tea gardens in the rain-soaked mountains of Turkey's Black Sea coast. There is a huge range of climate and rainfall. This is a map of annual rainfall. For comparison with something rather more familiar, take a look at the map of annual rainfall figures for Britain. The driest parts of Britain receive between 460 and 750 millimetres per annum, and the wettest parts, well, let's not mention the wettest parts. In terms of the map of Southwest Asia, Britain's rainfall starts in the range of the 3 wettest blues on the rainfall map of Southwest Asia, and the wetter parts of Britain are way off the scale on this map. Those bluest parts of the map correspond, as you will have noticed, to the mountainous chain of the Taurus curving along the south of Turkey and swinging through southeast Turkey and across the far northeast of Iraq and down between Iraq and Iran, the Zagros Mountains. These mountain chains have always had relatively low population levels, and there is little sign that they played much of a part in the periods in which we are interested. The Mediterranean coastlands of the Levant, on the other hand, modern Palestine, Israel, Western Jordan, Lebanon, Western Syria, they get relatively high amounts of rainfall because they are hilly or mountainous, and the weather systems generally come in from the Mediterranean, dropping their rainfall as they hit the hills. These are favoured terrains, and not only do they receive relatively generous rainfall, but their summer and winter extremes of temperature tend to be moderated by the proximity to the Mediterranean. This is a useful map because it also helps us to identify where we're likely to find, or to have found, the kinds of resources that hunter-gatherers sought. The cereals, grasses and pulses all favour hilly but not mountainous terrain, with moderate amounts of rainfall, at any rate more than 200, preferably more than 300 millimetres per annum. Therefore, the two lighter blues, the two lightest blues on our map, can be written off. And the regions with the two blues in the middle of the scale are the optimal zones. And now we can see why Robert Braidwood revised Child's idea of the Fertile Crescent from the Nile Valley to the delta of the Tigris and Euphrates as the homeland of the first farmers. Braidwood coined the phrase the hilly flanks of the Fertile Crescent, the arc from the south of the Levant through the hill country and swinging east across the headwaters of the Euphrates and the Tigris in northern Syria, southeastern Turkey, northern Iraq, and then on down the frontier between modern Iraq and Iran towards along the Piedmont on this side of the Zagros Mountains. Annual rainfall amounts are all very well, but there is another factor that greatly affects the scenario: seasonality. All the parts of Southwest Asia that are important for us have cool or cold cool or cold winters, which is when most of their annual precipitation occurs. And this is a rainfall map for winter, and you can compare that there are blue patches in Southwest Asia as there are blue patches way up here in the top left corner in Britain. So these two maps show the seasonality. Let's switch to the summer rainfall, and there you can see why it's a good idea not to go on holiday in the summer in Britain. But in Southwest Asia, you can see there's almost no rainfall. And when we move on to look at temperatures, here's a comparable one for winter temperatures. You'll see that many parts of Southwest Asia have winter temperatures not dissimilar from us in Britain. Anatolia, you'll see, is slightly blue. It has winters like Central and Eastern Europe. It's actually colder. But in the second map of summer temperatures, we can see the sharp contrast in the seasons in Southwest Asia. And we can understand that how low summer rainfall and high summer temperatures conspire to amplify the effects of seasonality. Botanists have reconstructed the habitat and distribution of the wild cereals and grasses and pulses. Environmental scientists have used lake bed cores to provide them with pollen. The pollens that they find in decent amounts are of tree species, especially evergreen oaks, terebinth, wild almond. Where these tree species existed in open woodland, you would have found wild wheat, wild barley or rye, wild beans, wild vetches, lentils, maybe chickpeas. Here is a hillside in southern Turkey, in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, on the north side, in late summer, where this kind of paleoecology miraculously survives. This is the kind of terrain, though here it's late summer and the grasses have been are burnt out. This is the kind of terrain that would have been sought out by the hunter-gatherers. It's also the kind of terrain where they would have found sheep, wild sheep and goat. But a kind of landscape which is now all too rare. One final complicating factor: climate change. I've already mentioned 2 or 3 times that we're starting this story at the time of the last glacial maximum. There's a Younger Dryas phase and there's a Neolithic optimum. There are quite significant changes of climate and environment within the time frame that we're concerned with. During the last glacial maximum, which is approximately the time of this map, 25 to 20,000 years ago, there would have been more snow and ice in the Taurus and Zagros Mountains, but Southwest Asia in general did not have Arctic conditions. It was cooler and probably a good deal drier. This first map shows how the woodland ecozone that included the cereals, grasses and pulses might have been affected. The eastern half of the hilly flank zone would have lost its open woodland and the associated plants and become cold and steppe. The second map shows how the woodland zone may have recovered after the end of the last glacial maximum. The Pleistocene, however, had one last shock in the form of the Younger Dryas. And this third map is an attempt by the archaeobotanist Gordon Hillman to map the dieback of open woodland. He believes that the only zones where the wild cereals and pulses would have been found during the Younger Dryas would have been in that Mediterranean corridor. Now this is important because it is at this period, at the very end of the Epipaleolithic, that it's likely that some communities were cultivating species of plant for the first time and beginning to produce the first domesticated plants. If Gordon Hillman's reconstruction is correct, then it gives us a picture that constrains the first cultivators to the zone of the Mediterranean corridor. The named sites on Hillman's map are his main pollen sources and information on vegetation. They're pretty few. You may notice that none of them is in his proposed dieback zone. In other words, he's got no direct evidence of the dieback. The one site which is just about in that is Abu Huraira, and that is not a pollen site, it's an archaeological site, and it'll turn up in tomorrow's lecture. There isn't time in the lectures to go into this issue at all thoroughly, but you will hear some of this, more of this tomorrow. My own view is that there's too little data and too much extrapolation from it, from these too few sources. The idea that the advanced hunter-gatherers and the first farmers were confined to the Mediterranean corridor is, to my mind, not proven, which of course is a Scottish verdict, not known in further parts of the less civilized world. It is a big idea supported by too little evidence and contradicted by archaeological evidence, in my opinion. There's one final map in the sequence, and it reflects the situation a couple of thousand years after the end of the Younger Dryas phase. We're in the middle of the early Holocene Neolithic optimum. Temperatures have recovered with miraculous speed, and rainfall amounts are probably somewhat higher even than today's, and the full zone of the hilly flanks is available. A little epilogue. Old myths die hard. Got this on the web a few weeks ago. 10 ideas that changed the world. 1, farming. It's a remarkable piece of bad writing, which is hopelessly outdated. Perhaps the author, anonymous, of this passage recalled what he'd learned at school and was perhaps as old as I am. And perhaps his school teacher had relied on what was already an old book. The only bit of it that you would not be able to find in Gordon Child's publications of 15 more years ago is the date, and that's been plucked out of the air. It has no meaning at all. And here, in the opening paragraph of an article in the internationally respected journal Nature, is a version straight out of 50-year-old Gordon Child. But this was published only a few weeks ago. Exciting, but untrue. What I have to offer is, I think, exciting but true. Not exciting like this advertisement for a film that bombed in 2008. The plot synopsis is so awful, it's almost fascinating. It goes on, driven by destiny, the unlikely warriors must battle prehistoric predators while braving the harshest elements. At their heroic journey's end, they uncover a lost civilization and learn their ultimate fate lies in an empire beyond imagination, where great pyramids reach into the skies. I don't know whether Hollywood, whether Stonehenge figured in that epic, because I didn't go to see it. So what I'm hoping to tell you is exciting but true. What we shall see is the formation of a novel form of human community. Communities that lived in permanent settlements, that grew in size, with populations of many hundreds and even thousands, and that were sustained over many centuries. The prototypes, indeed, of our own way of life. These communities developed entirely new hunter-gatherer subsistence strategies that required investment, management, storage, allocation, processing, and great levels of collaboration. Later, they moved to mixed farming. I shall develop an argument that explains how these developments were possible and why they were attractive by means of complex webs of symbolic behavior and representation and modern type cognitive faculties. And I look forward to leading you through this story over the weekend. Thank you.